what you did that I think is so unusual and unique and maybe has never actually been done in jazz before.
I don't have a lot of regrets in my career, but this is one big one.
With a career spanning over 3 decades, Christian McBride has established himself as one of the most acclaimed and versatile musicians of our time. I first met Christian in 1987. We were both teenagers, and since then, our friendship has taken us all around the world making music, ultimately landing us here at Open Studio headquarters, where I had the privilege of delving into his musical journey. How exactly did you become Christian McBride? The answer may surprise you. I know it did me. It's a story with a very interesting cast of characters, including James Brown, Wynton Marsalis, and even the Grateful Dead. Let's get into the interview. Good to have you, Christian. How you doing?
Pedro, my main man.
Man, it's so excited to be here. And I was thinking, this is just like we always hang. We make an appointment a few weeks in advance. Yeah. We set up chairs. We have a whole crew here. And then we just sit and hang out.
And kick it.
Just kick
That's
it.
right.
Like we've been doing. I thought a fun place to start would be, I want to take you back to a little time that I know you remember, because I remember it, the early 90s. The Young Lions, the so-called Young Lions movement.
Right.
I would love to get your perspective on it, because you were really at the epicenter of it. I mean, we're talking about like Roy Hargrove and, Carl Allen, Marlon Jordan, right. Mark Whitfield.
James Carter.
Yeah. And also folks like James Williams.
Right.
That were already, in New York and were kind of leaders of a lot of us that were coming there.
Right.
But I feel like when you arrived on the scene, like thinking back on it, like that stuff really changed then.
It was a very exciting time. I mean, even you go back now and you look back, between 1988, 1991, that window there.
Yeah.
It was just one of those particular times in history where it was very exciting. It was very cool to be a young, up-and-coming traditional jazz player, you know?
Right.
And when they started calling us the Young Lions, I don't really know where that came from. I think we were more concerned about getting gigs as opposed to what we were called, right? But I thought, well, if we're Young Lions, what are Wynton and Branford and Terrence Blanchard and Donald Harrison? Because if you want to call us Young Lions, I always call ourselves, we were Young Lions 2.0. Mm-hmm. Wynton and Branford and those guys, those were the first crop of Young Lions, because they made jazz exciting enough that people wanted to hear more young cats.
Right.
And so that kind of set the stage for me and you and everyone else that came to New York around that time.
Right. But I'm wondering too, like, it's interesting you mentioning Wynton, like, and Branford, like how much did Wynton kind of groom us, in terms of like, I mean, definitely connecting us. I mean, he connected you and I and, me with Roy Hargrove and like, I mean, it was really an amazing thing that he did, but that kind of leading up, I wonder, like, how much was he orchestrating this consciously? Because it sort of seems like it later, but it was such a wonderful thing, I think, for all of us to be able to come together. Like you say, we just wanted to play this music that we loved. But like how, I don't want to say diabolical, but how like particular was he in setting this up, as like really going back to the mid 80s when he was traveling around and there was such a buzz around him and his band, even like when Branford was there and Kenny Kirkland and, when I heard Kenny Kirkland playing with him, I was just like, that's who I want to be.
That's right. That's right. I certainly believe Wynton was the eye of the hurricane, pun intended. Surely he was the reason why I wanted to dedicate myself to playing jazz. I think up until the time I met Wynton, I was really focused on playing the bass as well as I could in whatever setting I was in, be it, if I was playing in some school group and we were playing funk or we were playing classical or whatever it was, I want to be the best I can at doing that. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, Wynton was already a household name by 1985, 1986, and he had this very, he had the ultimate rarity in jazz history. He was selling records.
Right.
He actually had 2 gold records in the 80s.
Like
jazz records,
physical copies.
physical copies, right? You know,
Right.
Like what acoustic jazz album had gone gold in its lifetime? Right. You know what I mean? You know, like most jazz albums that do go gold, they go gold like 40 years after their release. Right. You know, so Wynton was a huge, successful household name, and when I met him, you know, all that charm and all that personality, but also all that seriousness, you know, that certainly rubbed off on me, you know, and then being around him, he was so consciously dedicated to, it's funny you might use that word, you know, diabolical, but, you know, it's kind of like, okay, I'm gonna gather all the young cats and get them now so I can make sure they don't stray to all this hip hop R&B. It worked with some, not with others.
Right.
But I mean, I'm thankful that we met him around that time, because surely he was the direct connector between me and you.
For sure.
And, you know, that's how I met Tane and Robert Hurst and Marcus Roberts and, you know, all of those cats, Todd Williams, you know. So I thank him for that. And I also thank him and Branford for making jazz exciting enough that all of those major record labels at that time actually cared about jazz for about 10 minutes.
Right. Right, exactly. What time is it?
Yeah, right. Because, you know, by 97, 96, 97, that interest started to wane, you know. And I think there was some exhaustion from, you know, I think the jazz community were sort of getting tired of hearing about the Young Lions. And there might have been some sort of subconscious or maybe even conscious decision to like, okay, that's enough of these young cats.
Interesting.
You know?
Yeah.
Part of me felt bad that it came within the community, you know, because like I said, I don't think we ever thought of it consciously as some sort of movement. You know, we were just out there playing, trying to get gigs, taking the opportunities that came to us, you know. And everybody's like, all these young cats getting this and getting that. Like, hey, I'm just answering the phone.
Right.
You know?
Well, I think that's where you, when I said you were kind of like the epicenter of it, I think you, from when you first got to New York, even before you were in New York, well, first of all, you had a shorter distance to travel than most, except for like Hutch, who was already in New York. You know, and other cats. But I think like you always did such a great job and continue to a certain extent of, you know, like you say, answering the phone, but like taking advantage of playing with Freddie Hubbard when you're, you know, 19, 20. And so, yes, you're part of this Young Lions thing, but you were also part of playing with Betty, you know, Benny Golson, like the masters that were a little bit older than, you know, not 2 generations older, but maybe 1 generation older or something. I mean, thinking back to it, they were younger than we are now. But
that's right.
But they were like, you know, we're listening to Freddie's records and stuff. And then even like Mulgrew, James Williams, like those guys, like you fell into it. I don't mean fell into in the sense of like, oh, here I am. I mean, it was lucky the timing, but like you knew all their music and stuff. And like you placed yourself in a position where you were able to take advantage of all that and also play with your peers, you know, playing Roy's first great band and on those records, playing Josh's, you know, first, you know, great band and that kind of thing. And I think it's such an interesting thing because I think that whole, what happened in the, like we look back now, we're like mid 80s to beginning of the 90s. That's not that long, but a lot of stuff happened then.
A lot of stuff happened, man.
Yeah.
Well, again, going back to, you know, pick a year, 1985, 1986, even though Wynton was a household name, if you wanted to play jazz, the ultimate gig to get was Art Blakey.
Right.
You know, you wanted to be a jazz messenger. Yeah. And, you know, I had really put a lot of time into learning the book of Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers because that was the gig that gave you instant credibility in the jazz world. That was the gig, or Betty. If you played with Art Blakey or Betty Carter, no jazz writer, no jazz critic, no jazz fan, no jazz musician could call you a fly-by-night.
Right.
You know, they're like, oh, he playing with Boo Hainer, okay.
Right.
we're good, you know.
It's like you get into Princeton or Harvard,
Yeah.
not because your dad went there. Like,
That's right.
You actually got accepted there.
Right,
You're in the big leagues.
Exactly. So of course, learning the repertoire of the Jazz Messengers, you're not actually learning Art Blakey repertoire.
Right.
You're learning Freddie Hubbard repertoire. You're learning Wayne Shorter repertoire. You're learning Cedar Walton repertoire, Benny Golson, Hank Mobley, Lee Morgan. So and then all of the cats who were of a more modern era, like James Williams and Mulgrew and Terrence and Wynton and Billy Pierce and all these people.
Yeah.
So
Bobby Watson.
Yeah. You know, who was also very, very important to that whole era of the 80s. And so I'm learning all of this music. And so my goal was not necessarily to play with Wynton. I mean, even Wynton was the household name, and he was the man who the spotlight was on.
Yeah.
But I don't think either one of us were foolish. We knew that if we really, really wanted to learn this music, we get with the people that helped create the language. And those were your Benny Golsons, you know, those were your Freddie Hubbards, you know, those were your Clark Terrys, you know, and that's who we wanted to play with. And so when I got to town, you know, I was playing with Roy.
Yeah.
You know, Joshua wasn't around yet, but yeah, I knew Hutch, I knew Whitfield, and we were all kind of coming up together. But we were all working with a lot of the older cats because we knew that's how we would gain credibility.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and that's where I think that, you know, the whole Wynton diabolical, and I mean that in like the most you know, beautiful way in terms of like
not in a literal way.
Not in a literal way, but
yeah.
like in a very calculating and like, but I think there was also what's maybe misunderstood about that too. It was only up to a point. Like, you know, I'm pretty sure Wynton wasn't like, yeah, I'm gonna call Freddie and hook you up with a gig. I got you, McBride. It's like the musicians, like when you came up and stuff, like you say, your phone was just ringing. People heard about it. Was like, it was pre-internet, but there was like the jazz underground internet where you'd hear about such and such and such and such. And
I actually still think that might be the case. You know, I mean, I think even in the modern era with, you know, the TMI generation, you know, I think a phone call or a text message from someone we trust. You know, like if you send me a text and say, hey, McBride, there's a killing new, you know, piano player or saxophone player or bass player here in St. Louis, you need to check out. I'm going to take that more serious than, you know, some sort of YouTube clip that someone sends me like, oh, hey, check this person out. You know, if it comes from somebody who I trust, then I'll be like, okay, that holds a lot of weight. You know?
Yeah, and maybe we're moving back to a period where that's even going to be more recognized as.
I hope so.
You know, it's like, oh, this AI bot sent me a recommendation for a bass player. I was like, I want that. But you've always had such a great, like, as prolific as your, you know, things kind of moved on just from there, from the kind of epicenter to you, like, as we moved through the 90s, not only playing on what I think are some of the most important records of that time. I'm talking about, like, you know, Joe Henderson, Lush Life and Double Rainbow, two of my favorite records from that period, but not only playing on it, but holding it down on that, but also to start to make your own records, starting some of your first great bands at the time. But what you did that I think is so unusual and unique and maybe has never actually been done in jazz before is like you continued playing with your peers. You started to make your own records and form your own bands. And this is before you had like 5 bands at the time, but you had one band and they were good bands. And they were like, you were starting to exert your influence on even some younger musicians, even as you were still young, you know, kind of mentorship type of thing. But then you also continued and even elevated your game as far as playing with the masters, the Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea. I mean, that was a little bit, well, no, you had them on one of your first Verve records, you know. But like cultivating this connection beyond just the like when we're just green and like, wow, I'm nervous. I can't believe I'm playing with you, to like a real meeting of equals on the stage and like elevating your artistry with that. But I think that you kind of sit in a singular place up to this point of being able to, and now I'm gonna add another category for you. So you've got, you know, making your own records, your own bands, playing with your peers, Josh Redman Quartet, Roy Hargrove, that kind of thing, playing with the masters. But then also starting to play with like the jazz adjacent folks,
Right,
the
right.
Sting, you know, leading all the way up to Billie Eilish and this kind of thing. And you've always had that stream, that current in your career as well. But I'm just wondering, like, did you plan all that, or was that the same thing? You're just, the phone's answering and it's things that are interesting to you?
Hey, you know, my social media tag for a long time was I'm just the bass player, right? And I really mean that to a certain extent, because as a bass player, we're probably going to get more calls than we are to make calls, you know? And because everybody needs a bass player, everybody needs a drummer. And so the only real conscious goal I ever had was to play with as many bad cats as possible. You know, I knew how important it was to be around all of the older cats, because they created the music that we love. They created the music that we study. So what better way than to get it direct from the source? However, you, Roy, Joshua, Stephen Scott, Brad, Whitfield, Hutch. I mean, we were all friends. We were all on the come up together, and we all loved each other, and we all learned from each other, you know? And so, you know, it's not like we're not going to play together because we're not the masters. They didn't do that. You know what I mean?
Right.
When in 1969, Chick Corea and Jack DeJohnette, Dave Holland, they loved playing together even when they weren't with Miles Davis. You know what I mean? So like there's a generational bond that we all had, you know? And, but it really was a decision of really wanting to play with as many cats as possible. Now, in terms of the whole jazz adjacent thing, that was more interesting than anything else, because I feel like I never stopped listening to James Brown, as you well know. I never stopped listening to Earth, Wind, and Fire. I never even, I mean, I was never really a hip hop head, but like when Tribe Called Quest came along, I was like, oh, okay, they're sampling old jazz tunes. Okay, this is happening, you know. And of course, our big brother, you know, all the love and respect in the world, even if you remotely mentioned a jazz adjacent, R&B, hip hop, you know, Wynton would be like, oh, hell no.
Right.
You know, we're not having that discussion, and you're not going down that road, you know. And not just him, a lot of musicians were like that. A lot of older cats were like that, you know. But there was a part of me that always, in the back of my mind, there was always another one of my mantras was always get a second opinion. You know, so I would see people like, you know, I'd seen like Greg Osby and Setsasonic had a thing going one time, and Steve Coleman and Five Elements, and like that, you know, Cassandra Wilson was always kind of doing some stuff off the beaten path. And I was really interested in that stuff too. And I was like, man, I would like to get a little piece of that one day. But everyone I had met who had been kind of off the, like those musicians that were kind of off the beaten path, like the Knitting Factory kind of musicians, you know, your John Zorns, people like that, they were all like, oh, well, you were Wynton's crew.
Right.
You know, and I'm like, not exactly.
Right.
You know, well, you know, you like the new straight ahead guy. I was like, well, yeah, but if you call me for a gig, I will serve your music 100%, you know.
Now, is that something that you were like, at a certain point, you sort of started putting out there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, because there was also like this whole like, oh, you're a young lion, upright bass, you're playing with Roy, you're tight with Wynton.
Right.
You must be one of these, you know, these sort of puritanical, you know, jazz only kind of people. I'm like, why would you assume that?
Right.
You know?
It was the suits and the ties.
Right.
Yeah, the tie case with the multiple.
Format ties. But I remember the first time I ever did a gig with a jazz adjacent person. You'll like this story. It was Bruce Hornsby. And it would be somebody like Bruce,
Yeah.
you know. I don't even remember how I first met Bruce. I'm very sure it was through Branford or somebody in Branford's group. He called me up out of the blue. He said, "Hey, Christian, this is Bruce Hornsby. I was wondering if you could come play a couple of tunes with me at Radio City Music Hall. I'm opening up for Bonnie Raitt, and I'd love to have you there." And I remember somebody in Wynton's band, not calling a name, was like, "You doing what?" Oh, man, that's some bullshit, man. Why you doing that, man? I'm like, why wouldn't I? You know, like, man, you...
Radio City Music Hall.
You know,
Bruce Hornsby.
now, you know, I don't think I've ever said this on camera before, but here's where that influence, even though it was never a primary thing, you know, I think Wynton and his crew really did hold that much sway with the generation. So it's bad enough I'm playing with Hornsby, right? So this is, I don't have a lot of regrets in my career, but this is one big one. So we did Radio City for 2 nights. And
this was like, he did trio or something.
This was 94.
94.
Yeah, so this was the big, this was the range.
Oh,
this was the big band, you know, the regular band. And he said, "Hey, Christian, what are you doing after our gig tomorrow night?" I said, "Nothing. What's going on?" He says, "Well, Jerry invited us to Giant Stadium." I said, "Jerry," he said, "Garcia, you know, the Grateful Dead's playing Giant Stadium. Come with us after the gig, bring your bass, we can go sit in." And at that time, I remember thinking, if the jazz community finds out I went and sat in with the Grateful Dead, I'll be a pariah. You know, I'll never be allowed around the crew ever again, you know. And I'm like, well, you know, come on, man, Branford did it. Yeah, but they're mad at Branford.
Right,
you know,
he's an outsider.
He's an outsider, you know. And so, like a young idiot, I turned down an opportunity to go play with the Grateful Dead. And of course, Jerry Garcia died the next year, you know. And
but were you like, "No, I'm going to Bradley's. I'm going to be playing rhythm changes all night till 2 a.m. instead"?
Well, you know, the honest truth is I had a date after the gig. Okay. You know. But so that's what got me out of it. Yeah. But it was still like, you know, man, you know, cats already side-eyeing me because I'm playing with Hornsby. Now I'm not going to, you know, go play with Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead too, you know? Right. And so, yeah, I regret that I didn't take that opportunity. Now, of course, later on, I wound up playing with Bob Weir, you know, so I mean, I got my you know, my Dead stuff in there, but never got to play with Jerry, you know. That's
so interesting. So 94, so you're like 22.
22, yep.
And even remembering back and just in general, because I think that you gave such license to a lot of us, to like really just the jazz community of the young cats coming up, and certainly younger cats, but even around your same age and a little bit older. Because I think a lot of musicians have always looked to you as like a big brother, a father figure. Even some cats that are like scary. 8 years older than you. I'm like, what? That cat's like, I mean, because we've known each other a long time.
Right.
But I mean, you've always had that kind of like intersection of, you know, just being a badass at your instrument, but just being a super cool dude to hang with, but also super charismatic and also like not afraid to like do what you want to do. So like when I hear that, I'm shocked because like you gave, I think, a lot of us just license to like, yeah, we're going to do whatever. Like we might not get the call from Sting like Christian does, but if we get it, he gave us license to say yes.
Well, I think things started to change later that year because having done those 2 gigs with Bruce, it was amazing. You know, we had a lot of fun. All the guys in Bruce's band were great. Bonnie Raitt was great, you know, and I just really enjoyed being around them. And the year before, I had gone on the road with, you know, 94 was the year of Redmond, right? Right. 93, 94, that's when Joshua became like a household name, you know. And his album Wish, when that came out, of course, that was with Pat Metheny, Charlie Hayden, Billy Higgins. Charlie couldn't do the tour. So when Josh went on tour to promote that record, I played bass. And we toured, we did some US dates, and then we went to Europe in the summer and the fall. That band reverted to the Pat Metheny Quartet.
Right.
I mean, I guess in many ways it kind of always was that, because, Pat was like, look, I'll hook you up, but you're going to use my crew.
I was
going to use my booking agency.
Right.
You're going to, everything.
Right.
So when we went to Europe after the US tour, it reverted to, the Pat Metheny Special Quartet. And like, I love Joshua. How can you not, Pat? You got to play with Billy Higgins. Billy Higgins was one of the grand masters, and Pat. So I remember once that tour was over, running into our boy, and he was like, man, Pat Metheny, it's like, man, I was like, what's wrong with Pat? He's like, man, you should be out there swinging, I was like, but Billy Higgins is on it,
Right. I mean, though.
Yeah, but man, and it's like, damn, you can't even get a pass for playing with Billy Higgins.
Right,
you know what I mean?
Right.
And so at some point between that reaction from playing with Pat and Billy and Josh, the reaction from Bruce Hornsby, and the third and final one, this also happened later in 1994. I got a call to play with Michael Wolff, the great pianist.
Yeah.
And Michael, of course, had been the MD on the Arsenio Hall show for all those years. And Michael wanted to make an acoustic trio album with me and Tony Williams. And again, it's like, Tony Williams, are you kidding me? He's one of the gods. I couldn't wait to play with Tony. And Tony had one of the most important bands of the 80s and early 90s.
Yes.
And so, Michael's like, hey, Christian, I want you to make this record with me and Tony. I was like, dude, I'll walk to San Francisco to make that record, because we recorded on the West Coast at Fantasy Studios in Berkeley. So the same band member from Wynton's crew who was grilling me on Hornsby grilled me on this. And I was like, okay, wait, dude. This is an acoustic trio album with Tony Williams playing drums. Are you out of your mind? He's like, well, man, I was like, man, okay, look, now I'm starting to think this brainwashing has now gotten to a critical point, And I was just like, I'm not down with this anymore. I'm trying to learn as much as I possibly can from as many people as possible to be a part of this, kind of this cult, because that's kind of what it was, especially at that time.
Right.
I was like, I'm so glad I never bought a lifetime, membership. I always bought day passes to the cult,
Right.
I was just like, man, look, I got to go play with these great musicians. Great musicians are a much longer list than what this group thinks it is, And I think once I had to consciously put it out to certain musicians, like, hey, call me. I love your music. There was a lot of, really? It's like when I first met John Zorn, because like when we first got to New York, Zorn ruled downtown Manhattan,
Wasn't that the original definition of downtown
That's
cats?
Right. That's right. Guys like him and Tim Byrne and all these people. And, I would, the microscopic sextet, and I would, when I first met John Zorn, I was like, man, I've been a big fan of yours for years. I love to play with you. He's like, what? I always thought you were. I was like, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
No, I'm not like that. Same thing with John McLaughlin. When I first met John McLaughlin in the lobby of the Meridian Hotel in Montreal for the festival. This was in the mid '90s, and his new album at that time was called The Promise. And I said, Mr. McLaughlin, I love your new album. He's just like, really? You listen to me?
Yeah.
I'm going like, so I walked away like, why do these musicians think that?
Right.
You know?
So did that lead later to the 5-piece band? I mean, is that kind of the genesis of making that connection?
Well, so the end of 95, I made my second CD, which was Number 2 Express.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, Chick was
Yeah.
on it. I didn't know that. I didn't know Chick that well yet. He had already called me. Chick was going to put together this all-star quintet with Wallace Roney, Joshua Redmond, myself, and Roy Haynes, the great Roy Haynes, playing the music of Bud Powell.
Yep.
But we made Number 2 Express before the tour happened. And so Chick, Jack DeJohnette, Kenny Garrett, who would eventually play in that Bud Powell band, he took over for Joshua. That's how Chick and I wound up playing together for the first time. It was on Number 2 Express. Now, when we went on the tour, just being around Chick every day and just like peppering him with questions every day, you know, like Sarah Vaughan, Miles Davis, Mongo Santa Maria, Return to Forever, you know, because, you know, we're historians, man. We love this music that much, you know. So Chick, I don't know how, but he said, hey, man, I heard you play electric bass. You're a really good electric bass player. Now that was the ultimate no-no.
Right.
You know.
You were looking around like,
yeah, right. Like, don't tell anybody, right? He said, man, you're a really good electric bass player. I had a conversation with John McLaughlin not too long ago, and at some point we're going to put together like a little co-op thing, and I'd be interested to know if you want to be in it. I was like, what? And of course, when he said that to me, I started hearing all those hard time signatures of Mahavishnu in my head. I'm like, oh boy, I hope I'm ready, right? And I said, who would play drums? He says, well, I don't know yet. You know, a couple people, you know, came up, you know, maybe Vinnie Colaiuta, you know, maybe Gadd, maybe Dennis Chambers. I don't know, but I'll let you know. That conversation never came up again for about 9 years. And Chick said, hey, man, you know, by this time I know Chick. We've been on the road. He said, no, actually it was longer than 9 years because the 5-piece band didn't actually go on tour till 2008. This conversation happened in 1995 or 96. So like 10 years later, he's like, hey, man, remember a long time ago I talked to you about that co-op band with me and McLaughlin? I was like, wow, really? He said, I think we're going to do it.
Yeah.
You ready? I said, yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, I really had to kind of go out of my way to sort of let people outside of the Young Lion, whatever you want to call it, generation, movement, sect, that, you know, I really love music outside of acoustic straight ahead, you know, but also trying to let the box know, hey, I don't think we're disrespecting the tradition or this kind of music by playing that kind of music. Every kind of music has its own soul, it has its own aesthetic. Just be respectful enough to learn what it is, you know. And I think there was a time where a lot of musicians, you know, you hear these musicians say, oh, you know, forget tradition, you know, that was already done in the past. We need to move on and create new things. Now, while I do think we're Renaissance musicians and like that we love everything, we never would shun tradition, you know. Tradition fuels the future, you know. So like the best musicians I've always felt have one foot in the past, one foot in the future with their body in the present. You know, it's got to be a combination of the three. So at some point I just had to be like, look, I just want to play with as many people as possible. And if the guys in the box have a problem with that, then sorry.
Right. Man, it's so, this is bringing up memories of 94. And I love you've always been so great at remembering like these like kind of touch points in time,
right?
And like down to I still think about just the mid 90s, and you're like, well, no, but in September of 94, I had moved, but I think it's so important because now I'm remembering like how prescient all these things were at the time.
Yes.
And And 94, I played with Roy in his
That's right.
quintet that whole year. And so I was kind of in a bubble and in a way too, but it was a wonderful bubble because, it was Greg Hutchinson and Ron Blake. That was my
Right.
first time meeting Ron. I was
Right.
on the very
Rodney
first
Whitaker.
gig. Rodney Whitaker.
Yeah. What a great band.
Yeah, it was great. And like, but I'm remembering now, like Roy had his own way of leaving the box, but still having one foot in
Roy
it. Like
walked that tightrope masterfully.
He did. It was different than you. But I think the two of you were really, like, you guys are the ones who led all of us, the whole scene, like, to what was possible in the rest of the 90s, leading right up to, like, the beginning of now that I'm thinking back on it. Because Roy was more, like, kind of silent assassin, like,
yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
That's
you could
right.
never talk to him about any of this. He'd just be like, But I mean, in terms of what he was doing with this, and I learned so much from him during that year. You play where the music leads you. Like, that was the first cat that was like our age that was just like unrelentless with that.
Yes.
Like, you do what you want to do.
That's right.
And there is no box. Like, the box is so damn big, you don't even know where you are in it.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of a cool bubble to be in. But I think that, and then obviously later on, like what he did just to push boundaries and inspire. I mean, up to this day, even though he's not with us, it's like, I really think there isn't a more inspirational. I mean, of course, the trumpet players coming up and stuff, like he's the cat.
That's right.
And I think for us, because we were around him and stuff, like, I mean, certainly we recognized how great he was in his artistry, but he was very like quiet and understated with his approach to this.
And most important, what I think we miss about Hargrove, RH Factor, play with all these R&B and hip hoppers, wonderful, great. But at the end of the day, Roy wanted to make sure you could swing, that you could play changes, that you were using your ear, you played the correct melody, because while everybody thinks Roy was so cool in branching out, doing all this R&B and hip hop stuff, Roy's main thing was going down to Smalls and making sure all those young cats knew what the hell they were doing.
Absolutely. Right up to the end.
Right up until the end. Jasmine Horn always loves telling this story about, she'd be up there singing and Roy would be sitting in the audience like, wrong lyric. Get it right.
Right.
And so like while he was, people always say, oh yeah, he wasn't one of them, old school straight up jazz guys. Well, he kind of was when he was playing jazz.
Yeah. He was kind of the most like, play the changes this way. I know.
Get it right.
Like every little detail. He was very detailed when it came to straight ahead stuff.
And so I feel like, and going back to Wynton, why I think he was so important is because, he kind of saw the landscape of what was going on because let's face it, somehow jazz is cooler to people as long as it's not actually jazz, right? Like jazz is the only music that has to make itself credible by enumerating all of these other things. Oh, I just don't play jazz.
Right.
Oh, well then you're a great jazz musician, right?
Right.
You don't hear hip hop star, oh, I don't just do hip hop, I incorporate world music. I incorporate polkas, hardcore hip hoppers like, well, why would you do that? Keep it real, Bluegrass musicians don't do that. Right. Bluegrass musicians are like, no.
Right.
You're gonna play like this. This is how it's been. This is how it's always gonna be, But somehow jazz, you always have to make excuses like, no, I'm not one of those straight up, straight-laced jazz guys.
Right.
And I think Wynton came along, he was like, why? What's wrong with that? Seems like everybody who likes jazz doesn't actually like jazz. They like things that they believe sound like jazz. And so through, a little hubris, a little arrogance, youthful arrogance, which American public likes.
Yep.
He made everybody go, shh, oh, wait, he's kind of right. We forgot about this.
Yeah.
So in the sense that he kind of reset everyone's focus on what jazz actually is, he was very important for that.
Absolutely.
Now, of course, I think it kind of went overboard, as most movements do.
Right. But do you think that, thinking back to that, that was very controversial, not just for like focusing listeners and the industry. I mean, think about all the stuff with like George Butler and Columbia Records and Miles and all that stuff, but also for older musicians. Like he was very polarizing, because some of the older musicians were like, yeah, exactly, we've been waiting for someone to come along.
Right.
But then if it didn't lead to them being, being front and center, then they're like, oh, now we're against them. I was like, wait, I thought you were. But I think also there was such a great ability from Wynton to be able to capitalize on what to him were very genuine controversies.
Yes.
Like you remember the musician article with him and Herbie Hancock?
Oh gosh.
Man, I read that. I can still remember what it felt like in the like reading that, and like
I think that, you were like, I was like 13, maybe you were 14 when it,
Because it was like 84, 85.
85, I think it was, yeah.
And that, because that was the same year that Black Coats came out.
Right.
And I heard Kenny Kirkland write it. Know, so that was a big, year. But like that was so inspiring to me to see somebody that was like standing up for something.
Right.
You know what I mean? And being like, no, this. And then the music I loved. And so it started to kind of crystallize, I think, for a lot of us.
Yeah.
But I mean, Wynton was able to, well, it just makes me think. And my question to you is this. Like, do we not have enough controversies in jazz anymore? Because we used to have, I mean, think about, where's Wynton coming from? Miles,
Right,
and it's like I saw a thing recently on Nicholas's Instagram, Nicholas Payton.
Yes.
So we do have some controversies in jazz. But where he was talking, that whole thing with Miles and Stevie Wonder and how Miles had talked. And, we kind of know in the jazz community that Miles was like, he didn't mean what he was saying all the time.
That's right. Right. Miles knew how to play people.
He knew how to play people. Yeah. And Wynton to a certain degree.
Oh, big time.
Especially then.
It's a trumpet thing.
Yeah, exactly. Louis Armstrong, he used to do it. He was just a little more joyful about it.
Right.
But I mean, like, I do kind of miss those times, not just controversy for controversy's sake, but does it feel like to you that we're in this period where like everybody's so careful about what they want to say? You have to love everybody.
Yeah.
You can't, you can not like something, but you got to shut up about it.
Right.
And is that where we are?
I think the stage is being set for, I think if there is a next big controversy in jazz, it can't be from somebody who's already here. Mm-hmm. It's got to be from somebody new. Somebody's going to come along from somewhere. Because like people have heard me all the time through the years. They've heard Nicholas. They've heard Robert Glasper. They've heard Wynton. They've heard Branford. Nothing they can say at this point is really going to mean that much to the jazz community at large. It's going to have to come from somebody between the ages of 20, 25, a little bold, a little arrogant, and say, look, I'm putting all y'all on blast.
Right.
That's where the next controversy is coming from.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you see that happening? Or
it'll happen.
Okay.
It'll happen.
But it's going to be an outlier.
Yes. Yes. I'll tell you, one of the greatest things I've seen in jazz is jazz memes. I'm a big fan of jazz memes because I think jazz in general takes itself too seriously. Yes, we are the most thoroughly trained group of musicians in the world. We can improvise. We can compose. We can orchestrate. We can do all of these different things on a very high level. But we shouldn't we shouldn't have a holier than thou conscious because of that, And I love the fact that jazz memes pokes fun at the jazz community. I love it.
Yeah. No, I agree. That's not something we're naturally have a proclivity for.
Exactly.
But
we don't like being teased.
Right. But if you think about any other genre, even like classical music, which, you could line up jazz with classical in some of the same ways in terms of like, we're the best trained, we can do all this. And we don't care if the people don't like us. We're here for the art, that whole thing. But in classical music, if you say, oh, I really like the New York Philharmonic's version of this, and I like Simon Rattle conducting Berlin better. He does this, like you can do that. But it's like in jazz, if you say like, oh, I don't really like for me, I always wrestled with like, just different classic recordings. And I was like, ooh. I don't really like that, but I can't say anything
Yeah,
because
yeah,
that was
yeah,
on a
yeah,
list
yeah.
of things, and it's pretty particular to jazz. And I agree, like the jazz memes things kind of bust that out,
Yeah.
you know, in a lot of ways, just blows it up, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and I have to, you know, I mentioned this to Dan outside, but man, listen, I have to applaud you for really making Open Studio what it has become, because this, along with what what my wife Melissa has done with Jazz House Kids, these are two great examples of, hey, you know, if you really focus and invest and dedicate your energy to something, which means when it's not going well, you keep going, you know, man, look what Open Studio has become, man. So, man, my hat's off to what you've created here, my man.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that means,
You know, when you said, you know,
everything
when you
coming
told me
from
years
you.
ago what you were going to do, I was like, oh, man, good luck with that, brother.
You did too. And then I had it in my mind. I was like, all right,
You
I'm
think you're going
turn.
to make money from this?
I was like, if I can turn around Christian on this and get him to be one of my artists on here, then and that's kind of what happened. Like that was, and actually I wanted to talk to you about this, just sort of jazz education in general. Cause I was thinking of your imprint, like we were talking about as, you know, a composer, as a band leader with all the different bands that you've had and the 5 that you currently have. But also playing with, you know, McCoy and Chick and Herbie, sort of the trinity of, and not just playing with them, I mean, like deeply engaging with their music, not just like, I'm sure you were when you're growing up with the album, but then actually doing it with them and exchanging and influencing them, you know, that, and then playing with the jazz adjacent folks, that's all huge. But you also have at least a couple of other big areas that you've engaged with for your imprint on the genre. And what I would really say, not just me, I mean, I think objectively, like you are the leader, you are the king of jazz of our generation. You're like the benevolent king. You're the spokesman, and you didn't grab it by like, you know, any deceitful ways, but I mean, you really are the one.
Jazz has a low bar. if
No,
that's the
not at
case.
all. No, I'll tell you, like you talk about among the range of musicians, and it's such a cool thing because you didn't push yourself there, but everybody, I think, down to a man and woman, feels comfortable in the community knowing that you not only have our backs, but like that you are repping what this is when you go out into the GP, the general population, you know? And I think because you've engaged like with media, you know, with the stuff on NPR, Jazz Night in America, you know, going back to conversations with Christian, like I know these are things that like took time and energy while you were doing all the music stuff and somehow keeping this amazing. And a lot of it's probably people think it's super glamorous, but you know, it's thankless work and hours, but I got to commend you on that and really shaping the public's perception of what this music is.
That's very, very kind of you, brother. You
Yeah.
can send me an invoice for those wonderful
No,
words.
it's the reality of it.
You know, I think out of all of the things that you said, I also have to remind a lot of people that this is the most important thing, you know, because this is what brought me to the dance.
Yeah, but
you
you've
know?
never forgotten that. You have never. I mean, I'm sure for you, you think sometimes you're like, oh, you know,
I gotta get to my act.
yeah,
right,
but it's
right.
like such around the edges, nobody's noticing, you know.
Oh, man.
And then you look at all the great young bass players coming up, and not just bass players, pianists, everything, like people that want to make a record and compose music and actually have a band and do the stuff that you've done over and over again. You've had a huge imprint on that, and that's why I'm wondering how, through education, well, I would say too, like with the institutions, you know, music director of the Newport Jazz Festival, which like you've really gotten a chance to, you know, flap your wings now and like really take that to the next level and to the next generation. And then even like the LA Creative Chair when you were doing that with the LA Phil and the programming you brought there. But in terms of education, I know you've worked closely with Jazz House Kids, and you guys have a great track record of the next generation of players, not just players, but just really cool kids that we see now out in the world.
Right.
And, you know, even if they're at a concert and they're doing something else, or if they're musicians, I mean, that's an amazing testimony to the work you guys have done. And then, of course, your really cool courses for us here at Open Studio, which were groundbreaking for us.
I hope people like them.
They love it. I mean, it's like you had your imprint on, I mean, I still remember when you came in for the first session and you were like, what's happening? Is this a live thing or what? And I was like, uh-oh, does he know what he's doing?
What we doing?
What are we doing? But I mean, then you just proceeded, as I kind of just from knowing you so much, and of course knowing this, but also knowing what a great communicator you were, which to me is the touch point of being a great teacher, is like, are you like you're generous, you're a great communicator, and you're a badass player. So to me, it was like no risk at all that you were going to come in and kill it, you know. But I've noticed like probably the only area you haven't gone in on in terms of your time and your energy is higher education. I mean, I remember years ago we did, I think we did a master class at Indiana University when we were there.
I remember that.
Gig.
Yeah.
And a few other times, and you're great at doing those and like inspiring and giving really good information, you know.
Yeah.
No, you got to listen to the, you know, you're master at that. But I'm sure you've had opportunities, you know, to head up a program or to teach or whatever. And for whatever reason, you know, you've passed on that. I'm just wondering, you know, first of all, what is your opinion on kind of the state of jazz education at that level, and how come you've chosen not to engage in that way?
A couple of different reasons. In 1999, I got a call from the late great Dave Brubeck, and Mr. Brubeck said, "Hey, I'm starting my own institute, and I would like for you to be the artistic director." Now, when Dave Brubeck makes a personal call, you say yes, right? And it was in Stockton, California, based at the University of the Pacific. And so I was the, you know, artistic director of the Brubeck Institute for the first 4 years of its existence. And one thing that I had always noticed with jazz education is that oftentimes when working jazz artists are running a program or they're part of a program, their attendance records tend to be a little spotty because I think that a lot of jazz, I think jazz education started, there's a couple of things. For starters, if you go back to the 1940s and 1950s, it was right in this period where there were a lot of the general public that still didn't take jazz seriously. They didn't think it was serious music, you know? And it wasn't until, you know, people like John Lewis, Stan Kenton, they really had to go to bat to say, listen, whatever you people think of as legitimate music, jazz is not only that, but it's more than that, because we can do what classical musicians can't do. And so those people really went to bat to make jazz legitimate. And so we started seeing I think Berkeley was called the Schillinger House, something like that, before it was called Berkeley. And then you started seeing jazz programs pop up in places like IU and Rutgers, University of Miami. And then all of a sudden, slowly but surely, you started seeing these jazz programs popped up that were being run, where most of the instructors were working jazz musicians. You know, people like the late David Baker, Kenny Barron and Ted Dunbar, and people like Larry Ridley, people like that really getting deeply involved in jazz education. But I think that as jazz education has progressed through the years, most jazz musicians really want to work. What they want is to be in front of us on a stage playing their music with great musicians. I'm not sure that there has been a majority of working jazz musicians who have taken jobs at schools because they actually want to teach. They do it because, well, this will fill in the gap between the gigs I can get, you know. And you know, how many young students have we met that will go to a particular school because one of their favorite drummers teaches there, and then they're never there, you know? And so
they're out on the road with us.
They're on the road with us. So I think there's a commitment to teaching that one must have for it to be effective, you know? And I never wanted to be one of those musicians that says, okay, well, I'm going to quote unquote take a teaching gig for stability. No, I'm going to look for stability where I would like stability, which is performing and playing and writing and arranging and things like that. So I say that to say that teaching at the Brubeck Institute for 4 years, I enjoyed it immensely, but I did not love it the same way that I love playing the bass, you know? And so after my 4th year, I got an offer to be the co-executive director of the Jazz Museum in Harlem. And with that opportunity, I had a long talk with Mr. Brubeck, and not that this was an excuse, but it was so hard to commute back and forth from New York City to Stockton.
Right.
So to get to Stockton, you needed a travel day, almost like you're going to Europe.
Right. Right.
You got to get there a day or two before you actually have to start working. And so I resigned, and Mr. Brubeck was so kind. He was so kind. He said, look, I heard about this museum gig, and as soon as I heard about it, I was like, I bet McBride's going to resign. So I say that to say, I personally never loved teaching, but also I think that one of the biggest challenges is that if you're going to take a gig at some institution, some institute of higher learning, you should really be dedicated to that. The same way you should be dedicated to a gig. You can't just take a teaching gig because I don't have any gigs this month, so let me go teach some private lessons and get paid and get benefits. Oh, but I still need 3 months off because I'm going on tour. And then they're upset when the school says, no, that's not what we agreed to, So I look at somebody who's really dedicated to it. Like, I'm amazed at Sean Jones, Sean Jones is really in it, Terry Lynn Carrington has been really in it, So my hat's off to them because they really take their job seriously.
Right. So you've also kind of famously, I think, I don't know if you know about this, that you're famous for it, don't teach privately. Like you have a very, as helpful as I've seen you, I mean, like any young bass player or really any instrument that comes up to you after the gig or on the street that we run into, I know you'll sit there and be like, yeah, do that, like you're super generous with that, but you generally really draw a line at that. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I totally understand that, but I'm wondering, how do you feel about sort of this generation of bass players that have still, I mean, really because of social media, because of a lot of stuff that we've done, videos on you at Open Studio, but they have access to not only your way of thinking, but to a specific kind of clarity of your playing in a way that we had the records of Kenny Kirkland and the cats we were listening to, but they really have everything handed to them on a platter. And I'm wondering, how do you feel about that? And is that kind of take a little pressure off you being you just don't have time in your schedule to teach privately, but some of these kids I think feel like they have studied with you, or that's enough, where they're like, oh yeah, I saw your thing from Open Studio, or I studied, your Instagram post and I've got enough. I don't even need to, try to hunt you down when I'm in New York or in Chicago at the gig or whatever. But how does that feel when you hear people like, wait, did I teach them? How'd they cop all my stuff?
Well, I mean, that's why we created this, So, I mean, it all depends on how it's being used. If a young musician coming up right now is very, very serious about learning this music, they will learn it any way they possibly can. I never taught privately. Well, I did teach privately, and it's not that I didn't enjoy it. I actually thought that I wasn't very good at it. My first private student was Kengo Nakamura, who played for many years in Cyrus Chestnut's group.
Yep.
And at some point I thought, Kengo, you shouldn't pay me for this. I think I'll do a lot better just hanging, because I know I've gotten my best bass lessons from Ray Brown when we're just hanging, I've gotten my best bass lessons from Ron Carter just watching him and asking him questions, Now, I get that if you want to have a really, 1 hour intensive one-on-one kind of shaped lesson, that's different. But I don't know. I find that our jazz heroes never did that. Wayne Shorter never paid Coltrane for private lessons, but he sure hung with him a lot, I'm not sure Coltrane would have taken the money anyway, Miles Davis never paid Clark Terry or Dizzy Gillespie for private lessons. And that's not to say that evolution makes that, we should do it just like that. I mean, hey, if my old bass instructor from Juilliard was still alive, I probably would pay him now for private lessons because he was dedicated to that. he loved teaching one-on-one.
That was Homer
Homer
Mensch.
Mensch.
Yeah, I remember
You remember
Homer Mensch, legend.
Hey man, you set the stage for me at Juilliard. He was like, okay, when you get up here, this is what to look for.
Right.
But I just the whole concept of teaching for me personally, I always thought I did better when it was informal. I get more into no, well, check this out. No, what are you doing there? I like that better in spurts.
Right.
You know what I mean? As opposed to someone paying me money to tell them what I could tell them if I hear them in a club. You know what I mean?
Right. Do you find like younger bass players, like kind of this generation of bass players coming up as receptive and like, are they navigating that sort of void between like social media and like being able to have access to a lot of your stuff, but then still coming to you for mentorship and that kind of thing?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. I've met so many young musicians, young bass players specifically.
Yeah.
They still ask a lot of questions.
Yeah.
They're still backstage after the set saying, hey, what about this? What about that? So even though they have the TMI out there, they still want the one-on-one interaction. And I'm glad.
That's great. I mean, it's always been my impression, and I think for years though, that bass players are always like, they're better at that. Something about like, if you're going to be a successful bass player, it's like there's something about your personality that's going to include that wanting to connect with, especially like a possible mentor as a bass player.
Yeah.
I think drummers are good with that too. Piano players, we're not always great about that.
We have to give a shout out to Rodney Whitaker as well. I mean,
Absolutely.
Rodney Whitaker really has
yes.
dedicated his life to teaching and mentorship.
Yeah, and you see look at the students that have come out of this program.
Oh my gosh.
Like that's always the ultimate.
That's right. That's
we got a great program. We just hadn't found any great students that have come out of our program.
You're right.
I was like, well, I heard some bad ones. Yeah, absolutely. Rodney
and the fact that Rodney pulled so many musicians out of New York to move to Michigan.
I know.
I mean, what is that?
And not even Ann Arbor, Lansing, East Lansing. Yeah, exactly. But that's another thing. I mean, Rodney's got that kind of personality.
Yeah,
like, come on, let's
he
let's
loves
go.
it. Yeah.
That's a great thing. Okay, so I got a couple little surprises for you.
Oh boy, I like your surprises. They're fun.
A little rapid fire. Well, it doesn't have to be rapid fire, but a couple questions.
I love this
I might have to correct you on some
it.
of these though,
Uh-oh.
just to warn you in advance. Okay. Favorite album you've been on as a sideman?
That's
I realize
a hard
that's
one.
100. Yeah, because there's like 500 or 400 or whatever. And I don't mean favorite as in like you love your playing or don't love your playing. Just an album that you love that you happen to be on as well.
I think the one that tends to come to mind is Joe Henderson's Double Rainbow CD with Herbie Hancock and Jack DeJohnette, because one of my Desert Island recordings is Joe Henderson's Power to the People.
Oh, great record.
And so when I got the call, say, hey, Joe's making this next record, it's going to be you, Herbie, and Jack.
You were like,
I did like Fred Sanford. Oh, Elizabeth, this is the big one.
It's the role I was meant to play.
Right.
I've been prepared for this role. Call SAG. SAG-AFTRA. Okay, you're correct on that because I have the answer. I said Lush Life or Double Rainbow.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I got that right here.
My man.
Yeah. No, those are fantastic albums. And we've talked about this before, but I mean, I think like the combination, and shout out to, was that Richard Seidel?
Richard Seidel.
Yeah, shout out Richard Seidel for like having, I mean, at the time we were all like, man, we can figure all this out ourselves.
Yeah, right, right.
But I mean, to have the vision, and Joe Henderson, I mean, like to go into those projects with such a, grace and eloquence in terms of what he brought to the table, but also like what became a strength, kind of like a programmatic way of making records. I mean, you talk about Shirley Horn,
that's right,
Joe Henderson, that whole Verve thing. I mean, like those are records that musicians loved, and we weren't sure if they were in the box or not. We didn't care, but the public. I mean, those are big records.
Not only that, but Richard really did sort of, I don't know if the word resuscitate or resurrect, but Bobby Hutcherson had a major label album again. Abby Lincoln enjoyed a resurgence in her career. Betty really enjoyed a resurgence in her career. Shirley Horn.
Shirley,
and probably no one had a bigger uptick in popularity than Joe Henderson.
Right.
You know?
And I mean, you could say Shirley Horn, Betty. I mean, of course, Abby. These are incredible singers.
Yeah.
That's a no-brainer. But Joe Henderson,
right.
playing the music of Billy Strayhorn,
and it wins the Grammy, and then like all of a sudden you see Joe on the Tonight Show.
I know.
And Joe was like, man, I've been gigging for years. No one gave a damn until now.
Right. Yeah.
So shout out to Richard Seidel and Verve Records for, they focus on the young cats. You know, Whitfield, Hargrove, myself. We said, but we gotta get the legends.
Yeah, and placed you guys in a way that was really interesting and exploratory.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That's right.
All right, so that's good. So you got one right so far.
Uh-oh. I didn't realize these were right or wrong questions. Okay.
Favorite album of yours?
I don't like most of my records.
Like, what's one that you might put on and listen to and be like, okay.
On purpose?
Yeah. Me and the wife are going to sit down, have a little glass of wine and enjoy this thing.
Which one has the least bass solos?
No.
I don't know. There's a couple of records that, my first record's always going to be special because it was my first one, getting to it.
Yeah.
That was sort of like the apex of the Young Lions movement,
You looking like a teenager in front of an old
car,
truck older than you out in the woods. That's a great record.
With that long coat on, so that one always has deep sentimental value.
And I just want to note, like, that was I think that was actually the strongest Verve debut of, now, granted, you had played on several other Verve debuts but not that much before that. But I remember when that record came out, I was like, you kind of leapfrog the other cast. You're a bass player. You're supposed to be like, that was a very strong initial offering. I just have to say, hats off to you for that one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, I think getting to it, and for different reasons, oh goodness, A Family Affair, maybe. And that one brought me together with George Duke. Mm-hmm. And so the record was fun to make, but it also, I struck a relationship and a friendship with George Duke that remained strong until his death.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So one of those two, am I right?
You're not, but although I just remember the George Duke connection and how that went, because I know he influenced you a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Not only musically, but personally. I mean, all of us, but you really got a chance to hang with it. And just production-wise and conceptually, I started to see that, which was a beautiful...
George was one of these people that, and I remember Richard Seidel kind of said something, too, because you knew George. He was a very jovial, fun guy, right? So we in the studio, cracking jokes, laughing, having a good time. So on the surface, it looks like you're not working that hard.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you got like 6 songs done.
Right.
And everybody's like, when did we do that?
Right. Back then, that was a lot.
We've been busy laughing all day long,
Right.
Yeah, because we knew we had 2 full days in the studio.
That's right. I barely remember those days.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So what did I get wrong?
Actually, I'm gonna let. It's your album. I'm gonna let you. I had Number 2 Express or Prime.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. That's like, for me, there's a number of your records like I'll put on and like jam, but I think that Number 2 Express was like the first record of yours where I was like, oh shit. I was like, oh shit.
Yeah, I remember when Number 2 Express came out. I remember Benny Green and Russell Malone separately. They were like, dude, okay. And I'm like, what'd I do? Like, man, that first song, man. I was like, really?
But I could also say, like, what was it? Vertical Vision?
Vertical
the first,
Vision, yes.
CMB band.
That's right.
Like, that was another one that was like, oh shit, okay. Well, you ain't gonna be at the Vanguard with this, but I'll come see it. But that was another kind of like, I like your records when you're kind of, it's putting you in another position as a player and as like a band leader and stuff. But.
Yeah, Prime, I had to, when I think of records where I had to really, well, maybe not Prime, but the first New John album, because, that was my first time having my own band with no chordal instrument.
Right.
So I had to like really, well, we made the first New John record here in St. Louis.
Oh, really?
We made it at Jazz St. Louis.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yep.
We're still the bistro.
That's right. And I remember I focused. I'm like, okay, I can't lean on the chords.
Yeah.
I better focus.
No, I feel like Prime and then just what you've done with that band, New John, and like, I mean, actually, in a way, I think the Tiny Desk, I mean, because it's such a cool kind of compact thing,
Right,
was
right.
kind of like really the apex of like what that is. I just love, having heard you in a lot of different situations, in the audience, on the side, on record, and on stage. Like, I love that play. It's just like a different McBee on there.
Oh, yeah,
that
yeah,
I think
yeah,
is
yeah.
really interesting.
Well, thank you, brother.
Yeah, man. Okay, this is gonna be a tough one.
Oh boy.
And I do have an answer for this, but I might be. It's gonna be a very humble answer.
Oh boy.
Favorite bass player album? Like the bass play. It's the bass player's album. And I'm not gonna say it can't be any of yours, but
Oh no, it
perhaps
wouldn't be none of mine.
It could be though.
There's a couple. It can only be just one?
No, you can give a couple.
Oh, okay. For sentimental reasons, not because it's particularly a standout bass album, but the first Ray Brown record I ever bought was called the Red Hot Ray Brown Trio with Gene Harris and Mickey Roker. Ooh. And at the time, I was just kind of getting into jazz, and I was like, oh, Ray Brown plays bass. Y'all know who that is. Let me buy it, And so when I took the record home, there really weren't a lot of bass solos. So initially I was disappointed. I was like, oh, come on, Ray, stretch out.
Yeah.
But then the more
right? You own the joint.
But the more I listened to it, I was just like, okay, I'm loving the sound. I'm loving the pocket, especially the pocket more than anything else.
Right.
He does a version of Lady Be Good on there where it's just nasty, And Gene Harris is playing the piano like he's playing an organ.
Right, right.
So I was like, okay, I like that. Marcus Miller's Tales was one of my favorite records. I devoured that album when it first came out. Jaco Pastorius's debut album, of course. And Robert Hurst's debut album. Robert Hurst Presents Robert Hurst.
Right.
That record was killer, which was basically Branford's Quartet,
right,
with Marcus Belgrave. That record that's one of my favorites.
Interesting.
So those four are kind of my ones.
Those are all great. I had Jaco's record,
right?
Just because it's like but now that I'm thinking, I actually would talk about Ray Brown, and I think this is cool, like for younger musicians coming up. And I remember when I would hear older musicians talk about this record. I think like when you're talking about that Ray Brown, the trio record, is like find your record that you connect with, like even how you were just saying, like it might not even be his best record, he might not even sold, but like it's still like it has that connection that you had with the music through that.
That's right.
So it's like, you can go listen to that record, but it's like find your Ray Brown record.
That's right.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Or your Christian McBride record that connects, and then it's not a matter of like this is
that's
the best
right.
one.
That's right.
But I'm thinking like, could we consider? This one's for Blanton, Duke Ellington, and Ray Brown.
Well,
is that a bass?
I'm sitting up
kind
here
of a
thinking
bass
like
player record, isn't it?
I'm sitting up here like I'm having a traffic jam up here because I know there's
you did great
bunch of records that I'm not remembering. But yes,
is that considered? I mean, I know it's a duo record.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's funny. Bigger influence on your musical life, James Brown or Ray Brown?
Oh man. Putting Ray Brown's playing, groove, mastery of the instrument into an aesthetic setting of James Brown, that's my life.
That's awesome.
And to know that Ray and James Brown actually played together, so that's Connor Brown, Ray Brown, right. James Brown, a lot of Brown in my life.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Well, man, this is such a great place to stop. We can't, it doesn't get any better than this.
DJ Vlad, you killed it.
Jazzy Vlad. Man, thank you for everything, man. Thank you for the music, the Peter. Friendship, but especially like I was saying, like I'm serious about this thing. Forget about King James, LeBron. That's cool to have that for the NBA. But King McBride in the jazz world, thank you for repping us in a beautiful way for many years and many years to come.
That's right, brother. Me and you forever. Yeah. Thank you, man.